Hello, Beth. It's great to see you again. How are you doing?
No, not too bad, thank you.
So, how many no comms have you done so far now?
Four. This would be my fourth, I think. Yeah.
And it's always great to see you speak. I've seen you at quite a few of those four. So, I'm really looking forward to what you're going to be talking to us about today. So, I understand you've got a dog with you. Is it Laddie, your collie?
Yeah, Laddie. Yeah, I've given him a bone downstairs, so he's quiet during my talk. Otherwise, sometimes he can talk a bit.
I don't have a dog problem, but I do have a cat problem who maybe start meowing at the door later. So if people hear that, it's you can't control the animals when you're working from home. Anyway, thanks ever so much, Beth. I'm really looking forward to your talk. So I'm going to pass over to you now. So here's Bethany Griggs with navigating the NPM ecosystem in the enterprise.
Okay. So hello, NodeConf Remote, and welcome to my talk, Navigating the NPM Ecosystem in the Enterprise. And this is a Red Hat and IBM collaboration. First, it's great to be back at NodeConf. As just mentioned, it's my fourth NodeConf. My first one was back in 2018, where this picture was taken, and this will be the second remote or virtual one I've joined. I am hopeful that we can all meet again in Ireland again soon. A little bit about me. So my name is Bethany Griggs. I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat in their Node.js team. I've been at Red Hat just over a year now, but before that I was in a very similar role, but at IBM. I am a member of the Node.js Technical Steering Committee. And also I spent some of lockdown last year writing a new edition of a book. And my role is really quite a nice mix between open source, engineering, and a little bit of advocacy. And just a quick plug of something I will be working on and getting back to right after this talk is the Node.js 17 release. So in case you didn't know, Node.js 17 will be released tomorrow. And you should check out my colleague Michael Dawson's talk a little later, as he'll likely cover some of the new features that we'll ship in that release. So back to my talk topic. So the title was Navigating the NPM Ecosystem in the Enterprise. And what I really want to do is share a little bit about a recent approach we're taking at Red Hat and IBM to help our internal teams and clients navigate this vast ecosystem. So the NPM ecosystem has been recognized as a slight source of friction in the enterprise. And this was recognized by the Node.js Package Maintenance Working Group in their kickoff statement, where they said, while Node.js has been growing rapidly, there are aspects of the module ecosystem which act as a source of friction to adoption, particularly in the enterprise. Why is there friction? Well, there's so much choice. There's over 1.7 million modules now on the registry, last time I checked. And this means there's a lot of really good choices out there on what to build your applications with. But that also means there's equally a lot of potentially bad choices too. And also, this is a problem particularly for a Node.js or JavaScript application, because the majority of your code that forms your application doesn't actually belong to you. But actually, when you deploy it, you're responsible for all of it in production. You cannot just ignore it. It has its own attack surface and maintenance concerns. And this is really not a new problem we're trying to tackle, and it's not specific to Node.js or JavaScript at all. But what I do find is our ecosystem surfaces all these open source and dependency usage issues a lot more visibly. I think that's just because how wide and deep our dependency trees typically are. There's been quite a lot of different approaches to try and tackle this problem and alleviate the concerns over the past years. And actually going back to my first ever conference talk, which I gave, which was at NodeConf EU, and this was describing one of our very early approaches. And that approach was to define some metrics and key facets of the dependencies that would help developers make an informed choice. So it's really about defining some metrics that folks could use to make an informed choice. And at the time, the types of metrics we were calling out were things like security. So does the dependency have a good security policy? Are security issues being patched? The license, so is the license actually compatible with how you want to license your application? Maintenance, so are you confident that the dependency will be maintained for the lifetime of your product or application? and also breaking changes. So how frequent are the breaking changes? How frequent are the new major versions of dependency? Can you keep up with their cadence? And also, at some point, are you going to have to make a decision between upgrading to a new major version or picking up a security fix? And then there's also compatibility. So is the dependency even compatible with the platforms or Node.js versions you're targeting? And we're quite aware that there are a lot of companies doing a similar thing, defining metrics and producing health scores to help developers make an informed choice about the dependencies they are using. So in particular, there's NPMs and Sneak providing these kind of scores and metrics. But metrics really don't tell you the whole story. Some of the most downloaded modules on NPM might not be a good choice of what to build an enterprise application with. And one thing that's crucially important is governance. So one of the key benefits to leveraging open source dependencies is that when you hit a bug or you need a new feature, you can go in and contribute it yourself. This means that actually when choosing a dependency, you need to have confidence that you can submit a change and it would at least be considered, reviewed, and hopefully accepted and released. And again, this might not be the case. Perhaps the project's very much controlled by an individual or it's a corporate controlled open source project. So it's something to consider. And another approach that we were taking was to participate in the Node.js package maintenance working group. So we were involved in the creation of this group. And this group is still active today, and it's working on promoting responsible module and dependency consumption, while also producing maintainer guidance and tooling to help the ecosystem. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about a new approach we are taking. And we're really taking this approach in unison with all of the other approaches too. So what we're doing is we're setting out to build a reference architecture. And we describe this as the team's opinion on what components our customers and internal teams should use when building Node.js applications, and guidance for how to be successful in production with those components. Some organizations may create something similar and refer to it as a playbook, but it's essentially a set of default good choices of technologies and dependencies to use when you are creating and deploying enterprise applications. And I just want to put the big disclaimer here. I want to share how we are approaching this problem. Our set of recommendations may not be right for everyone. And we're very conscious of this, even internally. We're not trying to say, always use this, always do things this way, but we're more pitching this as, this is a good default with tried and tested experience across the organizations. So if you have no reason to use anything else, you may as well stick to the default. And this really reminds me of my opinions on Lego. When I was a child, I enjoyed playing Lego like lots of us, but I just had a big tub of assorted bricks. And if someone had come along and said, this is what you're building using these bricks, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it quite so much. And it's also not about picking winners. We're not saying this module is categorically better than another. And on the other hand, this restricted usage approach is not actually too unfamiliar with our enterprise customers. Particularly in the financial services and government industries, as a developer, you will be told this is what you can use and this is where you can download it from. And there are benefits to that approach in the form of more efficient due diligence and easier risk management. So we set out to build a reference architecture. How exactly are we building this? Well, step one is just to bring together the internal teams and folks with customer engagements with the related experience. Bearing in mind that across Red Hat and IBM, I think we have around 350,000 employees. Step one of finding everyone who's operating or creating Node.js application takes us some time. And so far, we've built up a group of colleagues who are working directly with clients and Node, colleagues who are running internal Node.js applications, and also we have some contacts in some of our acquired companies. And we're really taking inspiration from the inner source approach to build this. If you're not familiar with inner source, it's essentially applying open source principles and practices within an organization. And this allows us to do things like exploit the expertise across the whole developer pool across the organization And similarly, it means we benefit from independent peer review from people across the company. And it also means that the various teams and developers can identify specific parts that they can contribute to where they have the most experience. So once we form this initial group, we work within the group to define the components that we believe formed an enterprise Node.js application or deployment. And this was all based on their real experience. Initially, we've categorized these into 3 kind of high-level areas: development, functional components, and operations. And the types of things that we feel fit under development components are things like developing in containers, code quality and code consistency, using NPM proxies and publishing, secure development processes, and testing. And then we had the more functional components that we were discussing. So these were things like, how do you handle authentication and authorization in a Node.js application? What do you use for data caching? Which web framework do you use? What do you use for message queuing? And this is where a lot of our module recommendations surfaced. And then we have operations. So I think operations has quite heightened importance in the enterprise because we're likely to be maintaining massive deployments. And the kind of aspects we felt fit under operations were what are you using for distributed tracing, failure handling, health checks, logging, metrics, and similar. And again, none of these are exhaustive lists. This is just what our group so far has defined. So once we defined all of these components, we arranged some sessions where we would deep dive into each component. We discussed the experiences within the internal group and tried to converge on a recommendation. And these conversations would be like, hey, what do you use for this logging or similar? And digging into the logging recommendation. So we brought together everyone we knew that were operating large Node.js deployments and applications. We discussed lots of various logging techniques. We asked them which modules they were using, where they were persisting the data, everything related to logging. And eventually, after a few discussions, we converged on a default recommendation. That wasn't that everyone was using this same thing already, but everyone felt that this particular module was a good default. And happy to say, we eventually converged on Pinot being a great default. And some of the reasons cited were that it had a very easily consumed API, structured logging that fit into a lot of our logging collection tools, and good performance. So thanks to the Pinot contributors, it's a great module. So once we converged on a specific recommendation, we published our guidance to our reference architecture. And our reference architecture is public, it's on GitHub, and that means we can go for a typical GitHub review process and iterate on it. And also, from all these discussions where we're talking about logging techniques and similar, we actually gain more feedback and more experiences, which means we can provide additional guidance. And the kind of additional guidance we can provide are things like log processing should always be done in a separate process. You should always plan for finding resting place for log data. So initially, you may want to store it in a quick access, quite expensive location. And then after that, maybe you move it to a lower cost, harder to access location. And then also maybe you should define an environment variable so you can set log levels in your application. So this was all of some of the discussions we'd had talking about logging, and we collated it and wrote it down as guidance. And this approach has given us quite a lot of benefits. So the first one is just finding the context. So our team works a lot in the Node.js community. So it's really useful for us to have a view into all the folks that are using Node.js in our organization, how it's being used, so we can use that to get feedback. Maybe there's some improvements we can make to the runtime. And also it's mutually beneficial because the product and application teams also have contacts into the Node.js community should they hit a bug, should they need them. It also means we're doing a lot of knowledge sharing across the organization. In these discussions, it's quite often folks have said, hey, we started using this module, but we hit this problem. And then another team would say, yes, we also hit that problem, here's the solution. So we're really fostering an environment where we can help each other. It also means we have a default set of recommendations for clients on hand. So if they approach us saying, we're not sure what to do to logging in our Node.js applications, we could say, hey, take a look at this. If you have any more questions, follow up with us. It also means we can have more efficient due diligence. So when you're a large organization, it's quite often that every dependency you use will need to be scanned, be that for licenses, security checking, or similar. So by targeting a narrower set means we can more efficiently process this due diligence. And kind of my favorite benefit from this is that we can do more focused open source contributions across the organization. If most of an organization is focusing on a particular subset of dependencies, this means that when it comes to asking for time to invest in our open source dependencies, which we all should be doing, it's kind of an easier ask because we can say it's not only benefiting our team, it's benefiting the whole org from us contributing to this. So that's a lot of the benefits. Just to recap how we're doing this. So we're trying to help the enterprise and our clients navigate the NPM ecosystem by providing a reference architecture with a default set of good recommendations. And we're doing this by bringing folks together, defining the components, having deep dive sessions into each of the components, and then documenting our recommendations on GitHub. And then part of this is to also continuously evaluate our recommendations. Because what might be a good choice to build with today may not necessarily be a good choice in the future. And we're even going so far as trying to predict future trends. And in particular, we were attempting to predict future trends in the web framework space. So you're probably not surprised that today our recommendation of the default web framework to use was Express.js. And this was mostly based on the numerous success stories we had internally. The IBM Cloud User Interface was built with Express, and also the IBM Cloud Garage, where we work with clients to build early stage applications. We heard from colleagues there that most of the time, the clients are asking to use Express. And then there's also the state of play of the ecosystem generally. Express has very high downloads, there's lots of wide knowledge, there's lots of tried and tested usage of Express, which means we know what it's good at and also what the pitfalls are. That's not to say there were not some concerns with us recommending Express. From these discussions, there were also concerns raised regarding the release cadence. There's not been a major release since in the past 5 years, and the last release, I believe, was around 2019. So that might sound really good from a stability perspective, but at some point we feel that because they're not having such regular releases, it may start to stagnate behind the evolutions in the runtime and the language itself. There's also some concern about using like async await and promises with Express, and also some concerns around contributions. As the release cadence is fairly slow, if we did have a fix or a PR we needed to contribute to Express, we're not sure how long it would take for that to be released. So there were some concerns, and this is kind of where we set off to evaluate whether in 5 years' time we would reach for Express by default. So I went digging to try and find some metrics to see if we could anticipate what was coming next or plan for what's coming next. So I started with some very, very high level metrics. I'm very much aware these are not exactly comparing like for like, and that's because we wanted to start with the widest set selection possible. And generally, many types of applications where 5 years ago you would have reached for Express, nowadays you probably would consider something in this list other than Express. So I'll dig into a couple of these metrics in more detail. The first is the weekly NPM downloads. As you can see, Express is massive still. It has like 18 million a week compared to Next with 1.8, and then everything else hovering around the million or less mark. Obviously, downloads to NPM are not a great metric. Downloads are gaining year on year, automated CIs skew the numbers. Also, a lot of folks are using proxies, so we won't get those numbers so much. But I can still determine from this, Express's relative position is obvious. To look at the download counts in another way, I tried looking at the percentage share of total registry downloads per year. So this is essentially charting of all the downloads to the registry, what percentage were for a given module per year. And I found this data really interesting to kind of play with and look at. So as we can see, the types node in the light blue is kind of skyrocketing, which along with the adoption of TypeScript is probably not unsurprising. And then we can see things like Express and React tailing off, and their share of registry downloads is tailing off. But that's not to say they're losing market share or losing share to each other or similar. It could just be that there's so many more modules on the ecosystem, on the registry now, that the share of downloads is just spreading much more widely generally. And I think there's also a suggestion that with all the types packages we're getting published now, perhaps that's skewing the numbers. And actually, what I was more interested in is the frameworks with the lower number of downloads and what was happening there. So this is a zoomed in version of the previous chart towards the bottom. And we can see Koa tailing off in a similar manner to Express and React. So again, that could be due to the registry just getting larger and more spread in general. But what's very interesting, I find, is that our frameworks like Next, Happy, Fastify, they're all increasing their share of the registry. So in spite of the massive players like Express and React generally losing share, these things are gaining it. So all I can ascertain from that is these are definitely frameworks to watch, and they are taking share of the registry. I also looked at some other data, in particular the Open Source Security Foundation. They provide a tool and algorithm to generate a criticality score. And this was quite interesting because it showed some different results. So we see Next and Fastify and Nest near the top. Another thing we were considering to try and see if we could predict some future trends was the contribution activity. So we dug into each of the modules, had a look at their contribution graphs on GitHub Insights. And a lot of the frameworks that you've probably heard of had a graph similar to the top one here, where it had a peak of activity and it's tailed off over time. So this may indicate that the framework's mostly in a maintenance phase. But some of the frameworks, the up and coming ones, did have more active commits and activity going on. So that indicates it's very active modules, so like things are progressing there. And then probably my favorite set of metrics to dig into was the contributor share of frameworks. So these charts show the proportion of commits that are done by individual users. So for example, in the first chart, we can see that the contributions to that module are mostly dominated by a single committer. The second one's mostly dominated by a single committer again, followed by one other person that's committing. And then the third one's a bit more spread. We see perhaps this is more a community-owned framework where there was a variety of people contributing. So this is very interesting to bear in mind when you're contributing to a project. It goes kind of hand in hand with this open governance aspect, like can you go in, contribute features if you needed to. I'd just like to thank Anton Whaley from IBM, who he spun up a quick app for me to generate all of these metrics. So thanks. So when will we change our web framework recommendation? Well, we're going to bear all these metrics in mind, but it will really be when we start seeing usage internally migrating away from Express. We have numerous, and also when we have numerous examples of tried and test experience with another framework. But we will continuously evaluate this and start using metrics as a guide to see which frameworks we might want to do some early investment in. So as a summary, our recent approach to helping our clients and internal teams navigate the NPM ecosystem has been to try to produce a reference architecture with a set of good defaults and recommendations. And this approach, we've seen immense value in just pooling together the developers across a large organization. And final note was that metrics can give some quite interesting insights, but what we're mostly looking for is tried and tested experience and success stories. And my plan is to package up all of this information into a blog with all the statistics. I've got some additional ones generated. If you are interested in our recommendations, you can check those out in the NodeShift dev. We've published our reference architecture there publicly. And with that, I'll probably thank you all for your time and hopefully catch you at the Red Hat booth.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for that, Bethany. That's a really, really interesting talk. And I really, really love those graphs on the contributor share. It just brings it to life that there are certain frameworks which are much more built on that community rather than the one person's brain with a little bit of support. So I'm going to ask you the big question, because I've seen a lot of chat with it on the chat channel. Is, do you have any idea which framework will succeed Express?
Yeah, I'm conscious not to try and too early pick a winner. And one thing I think comes into play is 5 years ago, for a lot of different use cases, you would have probably used Express for everything. But these days, depending on what you're actually building and what your app looks like, you may choose to use like a serverless implementation. You may use one of the more front-end focused frameworks like Next and Nuxt, or you might use more an API framework like Express. So I don't actually see that there's going to be a complete replacement for Express, because Express was very much a one-size-fits-all. I think it's going to be spread a bit more evenly, but I do think something for the back-end API focus will succeed Express, and it's probably likely to be something that does tick all of these metric boxes, like it's community-owned, it has a good release cadence, the license is permissive, etc.
Okay, I'm not going to push you any further on that because I know what I want to hear, but so what would you say have been the main benefits from the approach that you've taken?
I think it's been really, really valuable for us. So our team's mostly out in the community, helping keep the Node.js runtime running. It's really us finding the people that are building enterprise applications, learning from them, learning, their pain points with the runtime to see if we can try and help with those. And yeah, it's just really good feedback that we're getting across the organization, linking up with all the teams and gaining knowledge that we didn't have before we started taking this particular approach.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. I am going to say goodbye to you now. Thanks, Beth, but people can catch you at the booth later if they've got any further questions for you. Is that okay?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great.
Bye.
And there she goes into the ether.